What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. Coming off of a great season last year, Ole Miss looks to maybe take a step forward and be even better this year with all the transfer portal additions. We're going to preview their schedule and give you a very early projected record. Keep in mind, this is not our official prediction. This is simply a projection based off of their strength of schedule and how good we expect each team to be. So before we get to that 2024 schedule, let's look back at 2023. Here is the schedule for Ole Miss last season, and only two losses, Alabama and Georgia. Of course, had a pretty close call against LSU. Even that Auburn game was pretty close, but they were able to win those games and have a great season. And again, they had a tough schedule. They had Georgia out of the East, but luckily they got Vanderbilt. Those days are over, though. We won't get Vanderbilt every year anymore, or at least unless they do some kind of locked rivalries and they do wind up playing Vanderbilt. But it looks like they're not going to be playing Vandy every year. We'll see again how all that plays out into the future. But you lose that game against Vanderbilt potentially, and then you add potentially Texas or Oklahoma. So obviously the conference schedule is going to get tougher. And then you look at who they played in the non-conference: Tulane, who was a good team; Georgia Tech, who wound up being a decent team. Two teams there, and then easy games against Mercer and ULM. So let's look and see if this 2024 schedule is going to be tougher or easier than last year's schedule. You can see right away the non-conference schedule is pretty easy. Furman, Middle Tennessee, on the road at Wake Forest and Georgia Southern. Wake Forest just doesn't quite seem to be what they had been. They finished at the bottom of the ACC last year. Really difficult season. It's hard to imagine Ole Miss having much of a challenge in that game. So you get a pretty easy non-conference schedule there. No big time matchup. And again, I would say last year's was tougher with Georgia Tech and Tulane. And so let's look at the home schedule: Furman, Middle Tennessee, and Georgia Southern in that non-conference. And then Kentucky, Ole Miss, Georgia, and Mississippi State. Those will be the games in the SEC at home for them. Georgia at home is going to be a big one. Oklahoma is going to be a big one. Kentucky, that could be a competitive game there as well. And of course, the Egg Bowl, always tough. So it's nice to have those four games at home. Let's look now at the road schedule. Mentioned Wake Forest, and they'll also play South Carolina, LSU, Arkansas, and Florida. I tell you what, this works out really well in my opinion, because I think Ole Miss is good enough that they should be able to handle South Carolina, Arkansas, and Florida even on the road. If this Ole Miss team is a top 10 team like we expect them to be, those are three games you don't mind playing on the road. I know those can be tough places to play, but you feel like Ole Miss still has a great chance. They should be favored by a lot in those games. But then, of course, LSU, that one will be really, really tough. Maybe you'd want to switch LSU and Kentucky. If you had LSU at home and Kentucky on the road, then how favorable would this schedule be? But again, overall, the schedule is pretty favorable for Ole Miss. And they start with Furman there on August 31st, week 1. Then they'll play Middle Tennessee the next week, at Wake Forest on the 14th, and then Georgia Southern on the 21st. Close out the month of September with a home game against Kentucky. A very manageable month of September there in those first 5 games. Only one road game, and again, a very winnable game against Wake Forest. And then they get South Carolina on the road on October the 5th. Back-to-back road games, though. South Carolina and LSU. Something we haven't really seen a lot of with these schedules is back-to-back road games, conference games. But they've got that with South Carolina and LSU. That's LSU game is going to be tough. The second of a back-to-back there on the road, that'll be a tough one right there. And then they get a bye week after that game, so maybe you'd like that first bye week to be before LSU. Would have been a little bit better. But they get the bye week after LSU. They get Oklahoma at home, and then it's on the road at Arkansas on November the 2nd. Then it'll be Georgia at home on the 9th, and then a late season bye week after Georgia before Florida. And again, their toughest 2 games, I would say right now, probably going to be LSU on the road and Georgia. They get bye weeks after those games, so they did not get very favorable bye weeks. They play Florida on the road on the 23rd of November, and then close things out with the Egg Bowl. Right, the schedule right now shows that game on Saturday, but I'm assuming that's going to be on Thanksgiving. Surely they didn't change that. But anyways, the schedule is not too tough. You get a lot of your big games at home with Oklahoma, Georgia, Kentucky, and the Egg Bowl all at home. LSU, the one really tough road game that they're going to have. I don't like the bye weeks and where they're at, and I don't like that back-to-back with those back-to-back road games with South Carolina and LSU. But again, overall, pretty favorable schedule for Ole Miss. It's definitely an easier schedule than Georgia and Alabama. So it's going to give them a shot potentially to maybe even get to that SEC championship here in 2024. You can see, of course, Ole Miss 10-2 Oh, they were projected just to go 7-5 with our formula, only 7-5. I predicted them to go 8-4. Athlon also had them at 8-4. The over/under was at 7.5. So this team definitely exceeded expectations by a lot, going 10-2 and winning a New Year's Six bowl. I knew they had potential, and part of this was, some of the teams were not as good as we thought they were going to be. That win over LSU was huge for them. And again, won that game, a close game against Auburn, some other games in there that they were able to win and get them to that 10-2 mark. So definitely beat the projections last year. Let's see what the projections are this year. This is the schedule, and this is the scale that we use. If it's under 20 or over 80, those are games we're counting as wins or losses, games where I think the spread will be 17, 18 points or more. 20-29, 71-80, those are games where I think the spread will be 10-16 points in that range. 30-39, 61-70, those are games where I think the spread will be about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8, 9 points. And then your 50-50 games, those are the games where I think the spread will be about less than a touchdown, 6, so 1 to 5 points maybe in that range. And this is really not about the spreads. It's simply a formula that we use. We have different tiers that we put the teams in, and that's how we get the formula. So again, don't want to get too hung up on those spreads. But you've got Furman, Middle Tennessee, Wake Forest, and Georgia Southern, all games that are going to be in the green here. I think they're going to be favored by 17 plus in all 4 of these games. I know Wake Forest is on the road, but I still think Ole Miss is going to be a big time favorite there. So all 4 of their non-conference games, again, Ole Miss not guaranteed wins, but you would be very surprised. You'd be very surprised if they did not win all 4 of those games. And then we go to the games in the blue: Kentucky, South Carolina, Arkansas, Florida, and Mississippi State. Again, I think they're going to be double-digit favorites in all these games. I realize South Carolina, Arkansas, and Florida are on the road, but you look at where these programs are right now, Ole Miss is just way above them. Kentucky is a tier above those teams, but Ole Miss gets them at home. That's why they're in the blue. And Mississippi State, just because it's in the Egg Bowl, that one's in the blue as well. You never know in that rivalry. So these 5 games here are games that Ole Miss should win, but it wouldn't be a huge shock if they were to lose. Now, it would be a huge shock if they lost one of those first 4 games, but it wouldn't be a huge shock if they, you couldn't survive on the road at South Carolina or Florida or even Arkansas. But you would expect Ole Miss to win those games. They're going to be favored, again, by, I think, double digits in all 5 of those games. And then you've got Oklahoma. So Oklahoma is a game where I think Ole Miss will be favored, but maybe only by about a touchdown, 7 or 8 points. It is at home. Oklahoma is expected to be pretty good. So I've got Oklahoma as a tier 2 team right now. Ole Miss is a tier 1 team. That could change as we go through the offseason. Again, these are not predictions, and I'll have a lot more info on these teams when I do my actual predictions. But yeah, it feels like Ole Miss should be a better team than Oklahoma, at least by a little bit. And the game's at home, so that's why they're favored there, in my opinion, by about a touchdown. And then you've got LSU and Georgia. These are your 50-50 games. These are the games that I think could really go either way. But I'll tell you what, if Ole Miss is able to win all 10 of these games that they're going to be favored in, if they don't beat LSU and Georgia, it may not matter. They might still get to the SEC championship, and even if they don't, they're going to make the college football playoff at 10-2. I would be shocked if they didn't. So 2 games that could decide potentially just how highly ranked this Ole Miss team is at the end of the year. And LSU and Georgia, again, like I said earlier, these are going to be the toughest games of the season. So the projection for Ole Miss actually is 9-3. And you can say, how 9-3 if they're favored in 10 games? Well, it's just the odds here. So it's Kentucky, South Carolina, Arkansas, Florida, Mississippi State. If you average all those games out, you're going to have one of those games where they're probably going to lose. It's, if you're favored by about 10 to 14 points, and you have that many games, the odds would say you're probably going to slip up somewhere, and then you lose 1 or 2 with LSU, Oklahoma, and Georgia. And if you're wondering, the projection was actually 9.4, so they were very close to being at 10 wins. So they were literally 0.1 percentage points away from being projected at 10-2. So that they're going to be as high as you can get at 9-3. Remember, Georgia and Alabama were also projected at 9-3. That doesn't mean that's where I'm going to predict them, but it's just where they wound up with this formula. And so Ole Miss 9-3, they beat those projections last year. Can they do it again this year? We shall see. Give me your comments and your projections here early on the Ole Miss Rebels down in the comments below.